What's going on YouTube? Super Insane 18 here, and we are back with another episode of our How to Side Deck series. The Drytron episode did decently well, and I have been getting a lot of love for my Zoodiac Tri-Brigade deck, so we are going to go ahead and do an episode for that as well. Hopefully you guys enjoy. This is the side deck that I play for, my version of the build, which I will throw on the screen now just to make sure that you guys can see it if you didn't see the deck profile video. Either way, you should go check that out. Let's go ahead and jump on in. Alright, so you're going to notice that our side deck is actually a little bit different than it was in the deck profile video if you saw that, and that is because after some thinking I did decide that there were just two cards that were better off as other options. So we are running 3 copies of DD Crow, 3 copies of Artifact Lancia, 1 copy of Dino Wrestler Pankratops, 3 copies of Alpha the Master of Beast, 2 copies of Dark Ruler No More, and 3 copies of Lightning Storm. DD Crow is a really good card for this format. Granted, it's not as strong as something like the Cycle Reader would be, it's definitely more generic. It hits almost all of the best decks right now, meaning that I would side this in against Drytron, Sky Striker, Invoke Shaddoll, Salamangreat, Prankits, and Eldritch. The pure variety of what you can throw this in makes it a better option than Cycle Reader in my opinion. You can hit more than just the light monsters, and that sells its slot for me. Lancia is Lancia, the same as it was in our Drytron side deck video. This is mostly just for the Tri-Brigade matchup, but it can definitely provide some much needed utility against other decks such as Invoke Shaddoll and Eldritch. Pankratops doesn't really have a set deck that you would side it in against, rather it's just something that I personally think you should always side in if you know you're going to be going second. This card is just flat out free. It's more often than not a 2-for-1 exchange, swinging over a monster and then using its effect to pop a card, but even in a 1-for-1 exchange, it baits a card that would otherwise prevent you from continuing your turn anyway. Alpha the Master of Beasts is a tough one to tackle. If I'm being honest, it is a pseudo-kaiju replacement for this deck because of the synergy that it shares with the Tri-Beast types. It can even be better than kaijus in certain scenarios, such as against Shaddolls. Removing the Shaddoll fusion monster without sending them to the grave is a huge hindrance for them, as they won't be able to recur their fusion spell cards. Against Salamangreat, it can also be phenomenal because the special summon is not an activated effect. That means that it's unable to be stopped by Roar. This means that you are able to just swing over whatever link monster they have, which would either A, turn off the Roar, or B, even if they ended up having a second link monster in the scenario where they will end on Sunlight, Wolf, and Balinks, you can just swing over one of them, use the effect to return the second, and that will either A, go through, or B, bait the Roar, so you're getting rid of it either way. Dark Ruler No More is kind of like a 4th and 5th copy of Forbidden Droplets, if I'm being 100% honest. In testing, I just needed ways to out Herald of Ultimateness, meaning that you would definitely side this in against Drytron, but it can also be good against Invoke Shaddoll as well, turning off their Winda and Makaba, and even against Salamangreat it can have its uses, albeit not as much, mainly turning cards such as Baguska off, but I'm not 100% sure if that really warrants siding it in, just something to be considered. And finally, we have Lightning Storm, which is just a phenomenal generic catch-all for monster or spell trap removal. Again, it's probably something that I'd side in against almost any of the top decks. It's just got killer interaction, especially when paired with cards like Dark Ruler No More or Forbidden Droplets, turning it into the ultimate Drytron killer. Using 2 cards to out a board really isn't a huge commitment, so that really is just phenomenal. Against Tri-Brigade, you can also either out their monsters or back row depending on the board that they set up. Sometimes they have an Appaloosa, sometimes they set 4 pass. That just makes this a better card than any of the cards that can only clear one or the other. Sky Striker and Salamangreat, it pretty much serves the same purpose. It's just a Feather Duster that's at 3. Those decks rely very heavily on a back row, so clearing it is almost a death sentence. Now, moving on to our first outlist, unfortunately it's not as cut and dry as it was for our Drytron video. What you do or don't side out is incredibly situational on whether you're going first or second, as well as what the actual matchup is. There's no real correct answers as to what you will always take out, so that being said, after a lot of thought, this is what I was able to come up with. Torrential Tribute and Tri-Brigade Revolt are kind of interchangeable as the first cards out, especially when you're in a going second scenario. If you're going second, Torrential is usually just better off as any of the other cards from your side deck, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you would take all 3 copies out. It does still add a lot of utility, being able to be set alongside cards such as Solemn Strike, just to out any sort of crazy negate boards, but it's still definitely something to consider taking out first. Revolt is searchable, and that's really all that needs to be said about that. You can more than afford to take out 1 copy of it for something that's better suited for your current matchup, mostly if you're going second, but even if you're going first, the fact that it's searchable just makes it an easy out. Now, one of the all-time biggest complaints that I hear from anyone in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that they never saw their side deck cards, and that's what caused them to lose the game, so why would I keep a card that can just banish them? Yeah, Pot of Desires can also help you dig for them, but you're banishing 10 cards for a draw 2, which usually doesn't matter in a game 1 scenario, but when you need to see your side deck cards, the idea of banishing them is just too steep for me. I would definitely take out the Desires. Barrier Statue can be a tricky one, honestly. Even if you're going second, it does have its benefits. You play enough hand traps that the possibility of you stopping your opponent and then setting up the statue on your turn definitely exists, but it's just a much stronger going first option. If you need the room, you need the room, and this is better to cut over some of the other options. Imperial Order is another tricky one. It's one of those going first cards that 9 times out of 10 is just better off as any of your other side decked cards in a going second scenario. That being said, there are some niche instances that I found while testing where it can definitely come in handy going second. The most obvious is when Drytrons side in the zombie world and you have no way to out it because you're not siding in back row hate against Drytron. So keeping in the Imperial Order will turn off the rest of their spells as well while also getting you out of the zombie world scenario. Also, you would obviously leave it in against matchups like Sky Striker, but remember, all of this is just side decking theory for a generic vacuum situation, so some thought does need to go into it. This is one of those cards that I kind of flip-flopped back and forth on where it should be in this first out list, but I definitely think that there are some instances where it just needs to go. Blackwing Zephyros the Elite is a combo extender that is great, but not necessary. In its purest form, it's pitch fodder for the Karis, but realistically so is every other monster in your deck. Games 2 and 3, you're less worried about extending your own plays and more worried about stopping your opponents, so taking out very specific extenders for better cards just makes sense. Zoodiac Rapier is a strange one to be taking out, and that's why it is so low on the list, but similar to Zephyros, it is just a very specific extender, and if you're going second, more often than not, it's not even gonna resolve. So I would just take it out. Leaving in the Ram will still let you make Zeus, which will be devastating to your opponent, so it's relatively easy to do that without the Rapier. I just think it's unneeded and should come out. And finally, we have Called by the Grave. Now, I love Called by the Grave's utility in stopping hand traps, as well as just turning off certain monsters that have either duplicates in the graveyard or activate from the graveyard. But just like in our last side decking video, if you need the room, you need the room. And finishing things off with our direct swap cards, the only one that's just a flat-out direct swap is DD Crow for whichever hand trap is less suited for the matchup. Against certain decks, Crow will just fare better than either Ash or Droll, so depending on what you're against, I would put Crow in either one of their places. So there you guys have it. That is my opinion on how to side deck if you are playing Zoodiac Tri-Brigade. Hopefully you guys learned something from today. If you did, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, share with your friends, and I will see you guys next time.